A one, two, three, four. Tim Blackett, baby dabba doo, deep dee bop baba doo, ribby deep dee bop dabba doo, bo deep dee bop baba doo. Tim Blackett, baby deep doo, baby deep bop baba doo. Tim Blackett, baby deep deep, dibby deep deep. Tim Blackett, baby deep deep, dibby deep deep bop. Tim Blackett, baby deep tip tip tip. Tim Blackett, Tim Blackett and friends.
Every so often, I stumble into an artist's work and I'm taken up in a book that I may not have found if not for some happy accident that led me to it. When Invisible Publishing reached out to me to suggest I bring two of their authors onto the podcast, I was excited. It means the pod is gaining momentum, I thought, that someone has listened to it and found it worthy of seeking out, all of that. And of course, I said I'd love to interview the authors. It wasn't long, though, before I realized now I had plans to interview authors whose work I had never read before. And if I'm honest, this caused me a certain amount of anxiety. Until now, I had invited all the guests. I had reached out to them because I was familiar with their work, had liked their work, and wanted to talk about some aspect of it or another. Now, I was being thrust into interviews with new authors whom I had never heard of before. What if I didn't like their work? What if I had nothing to say or ask? Well, my worries were waylaid almost immediately. As soon as I saw the cover art for Sidney Hegel's two books, The Pump, named for the small town in which all the stories are situated, features two illustrated beavers in a bathtub full of green sludge, and I knew if the book was anything like the cover, I was going to be delighted. Birdsuit, their latest book, a novel, features an illustrated bird swooping from sky to sea, red feathers, green talons, with the face of a human woman. Both covers are beautiful, and the work within is just as interesting. The Pump is a strange little number filled with a cast of characters that are at once unpredictable and believable and relatable. A colony of beavers that are sometimes tourist attractions, sometimes friends for children talking and singing to old folk songs, sometimes carnivorous little beasts feeding on the bodies of the occupants of the Pump. Here, childhood playground games can take on a life-or-death seriousness in adulthood. Birdsuit follows similar themes around nature and our relationship to it, also featuring anthropomorphic creatures, this time birds, but it progresses past the Pump into themes around love and intimacy and familial ties, and the curiously thin lines between love and hate. Hegel has a style all their own, one that seamlessly mixes hard-nosed literary fiction and themes with talking birds and carnivorous beavers. The result is two books like none that I have read before. Even in the midst of what might seem, at first glance, to border on the absurd, I was deeply moved by each book, enough that I felt I needed to sit and stare into the middle distance for who knows how long, at the conclusion of each, just basking in the feels. The Pump was published in 2021 and won the 2022 Relit Literary Award for Short Fiction and was a finalist for the 2022 Trillium Book Award. Hegel's work has appeared in Catapult and Electric Literature, has been featured in LitHub, the Poetry Foundation, and Psychology Today. Birdsuit will be available later in May, and there's no doubt from me that it will be making a big splash throughout award season this year. Sidney Hegel is here to talk about their work. Welcome to Tim Blackett and Friends.
Thank you so much, Tim. It's so lovely to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you. I know we had to dance around with times and everything, but we're here now. So, yeah, welcome.
Well, thank you.
What is it about small towns that you think makes for such good fiction?
I really like the way that small towns pretend to be something that they aren't in certain ways. I feel as though things like class divides and safety are sort of more obvious in a city sometimes, but even just in the ways in which I grew up in a small Southern Ontario town, I found that there was this sort of narrative, front-facing narrative of tourism and beautiful shining Lake Ontario, and come to this town for somewhere to retire and for the fresh fruit and for the sort of homeliness of knowing all of your neighbors, and you can borrow sugar from them and go to little things with them, and it's just so cozy and a slower sort of aspect of life versus the big bad scary cities. When just beneath that, often I think that most people living in small towns are living a wildly different reality. not even just from those who are tourists who sort of come in and out at will, but those who directly contributed to such large divides in class and race and opportunity in those towns, and those who continue to benefit off of it. I find something very interesting about this facade of coziness and safety and white picket fenceness, when, much like the Gothic as a genre, the call is often coming from inside your house. Right. And so it's this sort of, I find it a really great area of potential play, to show the odd dichotomy between what is put out into the world and the reality sort of behind that.
Well, your book led me to a new term. I was reading one review and someone mentioned it as being part of the Southern Ontario Gothic tradition. And this was new for me. Of course, I've heard of Southern Gothic with Flannery O'Connor and whoever else, but I've never heard of Southern Ontario Gothic. And I wondered if you've spent much time thinking about that, or do you think about genre in particular while you're writing?
Yeah, I'd say genre is a little tricky for me because I'm not a fan of how confining it tends to be in terms of being aligned with just sort of like what we've made into the great quote unquote Canadian literature canon for. It's when my books are categorized as a Southern Ontario Gothic, I mostly like the way in which it sort of implies just looking at the pastoral realist Canadian image like from a different angle. It's not a complete fabrication of things and taking the reality of that land and making it into something completely new and completely fantastical, but it's using those surrealist elements to give readers a perspective into what's always been there just behind those pastoral realism novels that Canada is sort of known quite a bit for. I much like the small town sort of presenting one thing and coming from a very different, darker reality. Southern Ontario, I feel, tends to allow that same area of like an obvious conflict between presenting this beautiful, serene, pastoral landscape when at the same time it is not only stolen land, but land that we're killing at the same time. So I really like the idea of the Gothic just being pastoral realism from a slightly different, wider angle.
Yeah, that's interesting to think about. I was just taken with, I know there are many, many books situated within small towns, but I was thinking with this book and some of the others that I've just been reading, the strange ways that a book is changed simply by setting it in a city versus in a small town. The whole book is something different because the setting ends up affecting the book more than I might think it would on first. Like when I'm thinking about writing, the setting is sort of secondary to me, but I was really just taken with how like this book or both of your books sort of couldn't have been a big city narrative. It's just so stuck there, which is sort of how it feels like in a small town, maybe. I don't know. It was just really interesting for me to sit.
No, thank you. Something about there being no escape in a small town from every experience that you've ever experienced in a small town. Like in a larger city, if you break up after a long-term romantic relationship, you can sort of avoid the areas of the city that might remind you of that person and sort of like rearrange your life in a way of feeling like you're in a totally different place and sort of making it your own while still being in that same city. But in a small town, it really often feels like while you're walking through it on the only main street to get to the only grocery store and to the only park, that every time that you've ever walked through that street is like transposed on top of it and on top of it, like redrawing and redrawing and redrawing something until it becomes sort of indistinguishable from past and present. And something about that, regardless of what your experiences like were in a small town, I think evokes this sense of understanding and a nostalgia from people, even if it's a nostalgia for something that they haven't specifically experienced.
Most of my writing is situated in a city called McLeod, which I've made up, but it's basically Regina, which is where I grew up almost exclusively. I did spend time in a couple little small towns for just like a year at a time, so I have somewhat of a feeling for the strangeness of small town life coming from a city. But Regina and McLeod in my novels is like a small enough city that there's still room for like wild coincidences that might not happen in a larger city, like you said, where you can avoid people. But in Regina, I find that I run into the same people all the time, or it just happens that I have these weird things. So I feel like McLeod is sort of the best of both worlds. I talk about it as a small town in the books, but it's also big enough that you can avoid people if you need to. I don't know. But I'm dying to hear more about The Pump and how that came together as a book. I think I read it was part of your thesis project. Is that
Yeah,
right? Yeah.
it was my fourth year undergrad thesis project. I was in a program where we had the option of either doing an English literature academic thesis or a creative writing, creative stream thesis. And I was not supposed to really write like a book length piece of work, but I found that when I finally had the opportunity and space and mentorship to start writing, I really couldn't stop. It had only been 3 years since I had left the small town I grew up in. And it really, I think, took about 3 years of like brain turned off to finish academic work sort of association in order to like start processing and thinking about like, oh, like I am very different now than I was then. But that was sort of wild. Those 17 years and that experience it informs my creative lens a lot more than I thought it would. So I really didn't go into the project with a ton of expectations on exactly this many stories. Will it be a cohesive collection? Will it be interconnected? And I found that most of the stories came rather quickly. Vellum took 6 months, and then the rest of the stories took three, like in total.
Mm.
So the entire collection's like third draft or something was finished within the academic year, and then I did rewrites a few years after that. But it was compared to Birdsuit, which took years and so many rewrites and so many like complete rewrites where you start again from a blank page and you change almost everything about it. The Pump's writing always felt so oddly urgent and so fast that it's difficult to even quite remember it in a concrete way.
So what came first, the beavers or the town? I was so taken with the beavers throughout The Pump. I don't think I've ever thought about what beavers actually eat. Are they carnivorous animals, or is that just for the book?
Beavers
I
are
don't know if that.
vegetarians.
Yeah,
So
that's what I thought.
yeah, it's something I learned early on. The town definitely came first. I went into the project knowing I wanted to write in this like genre space, knowing that I liked elements of surrealism, slightly more magical narratives, but drawn from very everyday sort of situations and the quiet relationships between people. And I didn't go into it knowing that it would be about carnivorous beavers who eat people. But I found the beavers to be a very effective tool in terms of taking that Canadian pastoral image and turning it on its head a little bit. And I knew going into it that I wanted the land itself in whatever way that it came about to respond to the harm done on it in some way. like to have the final word and get to respond after being so heavily polluted. And I wasn't 100% sure what form that would take. And it actually took me years before I even realized like why beavers specifically and what that specific inspiration like came from. But a few months ago, like just this year, I found my old like church summer camp pictures and supplies from my small town, which is partially what Maladon or toothache is based on. And the odd church summer camps that we had were centered around this curriculum with this like large chipmunk mascot who just took over different places like Mars or the jungle or like the Wild West. And it was very, very odd. And he was like human sized with giant teeth. And I thought he was a beaver as a child. So it seems like specifically the beavers probably came from this like terrifying church chipmunk. But in general, I really like how when you use an image, it's never limited to what it started out as. It kind of expands and turns into its own thing.
I actually really like the idea now that you're talking about it as like obviously the beaver is kind of a big image for Canada, which I never really put two and two together, but talking about sort of subverting the tropes of traditionally Canadian writing, including these crazy beavers, kind of adds to that, as you were saying. But these days, there's a lot of writing about nature, but it seems to me it goes one or two ways. There's sort of this romanticization of nature and sort of setting it up on this pedestal. And then there's the understandable anxieties around climate change and all of that. But in your work, it feels a little bit different. In both books, the natural world seems to become its own kind of character, and it's kind of dangerous or even very dangerous. Could you talk about nature or the natural world a little bit more in your work?
Yeah, I definitely, with the pump, wanted to give a chance for place to be its own character, specifically the land that had been polluted and ripped apart so much to sort of get an answer back after being treated like that. But I've always really preferred stories that are both landscape wise and like morally and character wise, like swampy and muddy and complicated in terms of not being limited to binary like a perfect idyllic place or a complete horror landscape just from the lens of like certain people and certain characters. I really don't think that the pump would have felt as interconnected and rooted in this weird like spider web of connections between characters if the town itself and the natural landscape hadn't like physically really pulled everyone together and kept everyone stuck in that mud and sludge sort of. It's like when you're in such a small space, the harm that you've done to the people around you, but the landscape itself, you run out of room to deny it and hide from it and to keep like preventing yourself from being held accountable for what is going on around you. And eventually, regardless of how much you've built yourself up vis-a-vis like class or prominence or whatever, eventually it's just you and all of the other people there in this place that is keeping you stuck, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Well, this might be a me thing, but whenever I find talking beasts or self-conscious animals in a story, I sort of immediately start looking for a metaphor. I wondered what you thought about that. With the pump, I wanted the beavers to mean something, but they seem to be doing a lot of different things, and I couldn't pinpoint one central metaphor. And similarly with Birdsuit, I was looking for it. I think maybe it's a little bit more obvious in Birdsuit, but I wondered if you have any thoughts around nature animals as metaphor. I know you've been speaking a lot to it. Maybe this is a little bit redundant, but I don't know if it comes from Chronicles of Narnia or whatever, but when I see talking beasts, I immediately start trying to think of, or like Pilgrim's Progress type stuff. What does this correlate to with reality? I don't know.
Absolutely. Yeah, some authors I think are very skilled and known for their use of allegory. And in turn, there are quite a few readers who like being able to see something represent just one clear idea or message or concept or thing. And animals, like in the Chronicles of Narnia, are clearly being used as allegorical tools. But I find that it puts me as the author in an odd imbalance of power between me and my readers, who I feel like are co-authors and co-meaning makers, with me in the text. Yes, I write it first and put out into the world first, but the meaning making and the continuation and the evolution of what the book means continues through people who read it and study it and are inspired by it and are in conversation with it. And so I feel like, and this isn't to say that I never use direct, clear symbols and things like that. But I am a lot more interested in setting everything up in a way that feels most urgent and true to me, and without expectation, letting the reader be drawn to specifically what ideas and memories and concepts, like communal or personal, that specifically speak to them, whether it's right on the page in the sentences or sort of in the blank spaces between words. Because as much as certain books are about groups of subjects, often I think I am surprised every single time I meet readers of The Pump who have gotten things out of it that I never intended. And that is the beauty of literature, honestly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really like that idea of the reader being a co-author with your work, in that it's part of the writer's job, sort of, to leave it ambiguous enough so that the reader, are gathering things for themselves. That, like you were saying, I don't want to be that writer who's just like, this is how it is, this is what I mean, and that's it. I want people to be engaged too.
There is nothing wrong, I think, inherently with direct allegory or with being that kind of author and with having a different kind of reading experience. I just have never found that if that experience feels authentic to me in my work.
Yeah, I'm really fascinated with this idea of ambiguity in literary work. That leads me on to what I was going to talk about next, which is the influence of religion in your work. There's a certain ambiguity around that too, in that in both books it's fairly prominent, but it seems like religion sort of takes a back seat to the actual realities of the worlds you've created or the characters are living in. That is, some of them take religion very seriously, but at the same time, sort of not in the ways I have had experience with people who take religion seriously. It's sort of just almost a means or a coping mechanism for walking through the world with your characters. Like, it's never quite clear if they actually believe everything that they're even preaching about. I wonder if you could speak more to your decision to include so many religious aspects in the work.
Yeah. In Birdsuit specifically, it was kind of an interesting journey, because when I started Birdsuit, I had not sort of made a return to religious life in the way that it was introduced to me, as a child. And I didn't return to the same concept, even a little bit. But through writing Birdsuit and through a lot of the experiences that I just sort of naturally had while writing over the past 6 years, I ended the book being significantly more intermeshed in religious life than I had ever thought I would be. So each draft of Birdsuit, I can kind of track not what I would call a conversion, but a returning and a complicating and an expanding of what religious life means for me personally and what my perspective of it was as a child. I find it, I think, difficult when Christianity specifically is portrayed from a Christian perspective as very anti world and separate from the world. And this sort of like, well, if you are quote unquote worldly in any sense, which to some people equates to any acknowledgement of interaction of human suffering or of prejudice, then it is not aligned with religious life. Whereas I really didn't, I think, start developing my own relationships in faith until I stopped acting like to go into a church and come out of a church were like a very large barrier into the world and out of it. Like I used to sort of compartmentalize my queerness into a different area of life than religious life, particularly when I was younger and didn't see other queer people with relationships with God. And I saw, so much pain and suffering and discrimination that I didn't see how I could be religious, but also queer, but also care about social justice, but also write weird and creepy fiction, but also X, Y, and Z. Whereas now I see that like I am not only all of it at the same time in the same space, but none of it is in conflict. Like outwardly, people tend to act like it is. But to me, it's not as if I'm compartmentalizing religion and queerness and social justice and all of these things. Like all of it is the lens through which I'm writing at the same time. And so I don't think I would be doing anybody justice if it wasn't complicated with multiple things being true at once that come up against each other, and perspectives of being hurt in the church, outside of the church, by people in your own family, by people outside your family, through deep, deep connection communally, but sometimes complete disconnection communally, and then sometimes really deep connection, but also anger quietly and privately. It's every person on earth is complicated, and every person lives life through a lens of like very subjective experiences. And I try to really model a lot of it as much as I can to give as many people as possible an opportunity to have even just one line or one moment that they feel sort of seen in.
I feel like it's really remarkable that you've come to this perspective in which you can mingle them all and they can all coexist as one thing. Like for me, I grew up very religious, and my reaction to it as I found that there was that disconnect was, well, I'm just gonna like cut that part out. And I still think about it. It was a large part of my life for 30 years, but for now, it's just something that I've been like, I don't need to bother with that anymore. So for you to speak of being able to, reconcile these different aspects of your life into one thing, that I feel like that's a pretty remarkable thing. And I think the book reflects that. I had never come across religious characters that were so also just being themselves. I know there's conflict there between different things, but yeah, again, not a question. I'm just thinking about the depiction of religious people, especially ministers and people who are, in front of other people putting forth the gospel message or whatever. They just contradicted a lot of the literary characters I've seen, and also like real life people, but it was really interesting.
Thank you. I obviously I can never in one novel ever give a completely objective full picture of everybody's relationship to religious institutions ever. And thankfully, I would never try, because I'm a subjective person who comes from a subjective experience, and coming from any other kind of posture, I think, would be propping myself up to be more godlike than I can ever possibly be. But, it is never, I think, an entirely binary situation in which multiple things are not true at the same time, which is, I also think, why so much of the religious stuff, particularly in Pursuit, is deeply intermeshed with familial stuff, because anyone who has grown up in a family of any kind knows that even in the most most perfect or traumatic of experiences, there is a muddiness and a complication, and you can both love and fear people at the same time and want safety for people while being disappointed in them at the same time. And the same thing is true of faith.
In Birdsuit in particular, I spent a lot of time thinking about parenthood in relation to maybe other relationships. It seems in all of the parent-child relationships, there's this confusion for the characters around who or should be more important, the child or the spouse or the partner, from the perspective of the parent. And even from the children, it seems to have they seem to have certain anxieties around loving parents who sometimes, even most times, have acted in a way that maybe doesn't deserve reciprocated love or whatever. Did you want to speak more about that? What were you thinking about regarding parenthood and these familial relationships that you were just talking about while writing Birdsuit?
Yeah, I think it's particularly what I was speaking to before about it being deeply intertwined and like unseparable between the religious stuff. Is that the way that isolation works within families, particularly in small towns and particularly in religious upbringings, often is this sense and confusion, regardless of whether your parents are directly involved in ministry or not, of authority and parenthood intermingling with your concept of God or faith or whatever sort of your spiritual draw is, and sort of conflicting feelings that I think a lot of children and adults go through. I wish I had an easier sort of answer
Well,
to that. Yeah.
I don't think there is an easy answer. I mean, even
No.
in everyone's real life, our relationships with our parents and our kids is like a complicated thing, and
Absolutely. It's super complicated
yeah.
to see a sort of copy or essence of yourself and to both want to understand their perspective, but to never be able to do so. And then, particularly in the way of the book deals with intergenerational trauma quite a bit, not in terms of absolving everybody of guilt, but the ways in which experiences of our parents impact their parenting and then give us experiences that are also complicated, and the ways in which they are interacting with their parents and we are interacting with them, and all of these relationships impact our perceptions of what family means, of what God means, of what it means to be protected or hurt, of who we blame when bad things happen, or what we blame, and our sense of self. And it gets so complicated and muddy even just to talk about it, I think, because there is no depiction that will sort of safely encompass everybody's experience at the same time. But I think everyone can attest to how complicated it really is.
Mm-hmm. Well, I really appreciated in the book how the perspective shifts from character to character. In fact, as the book starts, I was taken with how people talk about a novel drawing you into its world or whatever. I felt like Birdsuit kind of literally draws you in. It starts with this sort of zoomed out perspective of Port Peter, which is this town the book is set in, tourist town. So it's like a large outside view of all the tourists buying peaches and whatever else. But then as you move through the next 3 or 4 chapters, it gets like more and more deeper and sort of close up of the townsfolk. I was surprised at how thoughtfully it moved deeper and deeper until you got a detailed look at, generations of people within one family. And then, of course, all the characters are connected in the end. And I guess that's just a long way of saying there's no way of giving a hard and fast, this is how it is perspective, but the way the book is moving, you get to see a child being abused by their father, say, but then you also get to see the father and how he is conflicted about that, maybe obviously, but you get to see his perspective. He's not just like a sort of faceless villain up there being abusive. You get to see all aspects of it, and I just found that to be particularly powerful. I guess that's a long way of asking a question about perspective. You've done a masterful job of writing in many perspectives, believably and honestly, and I wondered what that was like for you, being able to go from the father to the mother and the child, but then also in all these different families and then some sort of fantastical creatures at the same time, making them believable. What was it like shifting perspectives so much throughout the process?
Yeah. So Pursuit, even from its very first draft, was separated into different perspectives. And for a while, before certain characters were even brought in or formed, or certain narratives were constructed, it was from just Georgia, Isaiah, and Arlo's perspectives.
Mm.
In the very early drafts of the book, actually, there are probably a good 50 to 60,000 words of chapters and scenes, like exclusively from Arlo's perspective, that were cut just for the sake of time and redundancy. And it also, like, as the narrative developed, I realized that I wanted more autonomy for the characters who were experiencing certain things. I will say that there is a scene in the book that used to be written from Arlo's perspective that is now not from his perspective. And if that was probably the moment I can point to as the largest shift in my understanding of the narrative and the characters, and in doing justice for these characters, not being, shaping the plot as to go easy on them, but to give them the amount of agency they deserve in telling their own stories, particularly when it's very important to me that they are the ones doing so.
I really appreciated. I'm having trouble remembering Arlo's wife's name, but
Felicity.
Felicity, right? I I really enjoyed her perspective, and this leads me to the next question I was going to ask about. I read somewhere, maybe it was even a Goodreads review, but someone called the book a feminist revenge tale. And in certain ways, I can see that, but I wondered if you wanted to speak to that. I speak to many writers who are often called feminist writers outside of their work, and even those people who identify as feminists in their, real life would not say they are a feminist writer. Do you have any thoughts regarding, I guess, that statement and Birdsuit, and this idea of being a feminist writer, or is it just, what do you think about that?
Yeah, it's like I am not allergic to being associated with the term at all. I would say that when we use labels like that, when people haven't been using the labels like for themselves, it sometimes limits the amount of complications that can be within a work of art. And automatically, I think some people would see, like, oh, it's a feminist revenge tale, and not pick it up because their idea of what a feminist revenge tale doesn't align with what they want to read. And that isn't to say that every book is for everyone. Absolutely not. I don't need or want a bigoted readership at all. That's fine by me if you just leave the book. But what I find that, like, that's why I feel like things like genre and direct allegory are so tricky for me, because they feel more limiting than expansive and exploratory. Is it a feminist book? I would say yes, in terms of the ways that the Homeric siren bird women are given their own sort of perspective in a societal kind of way. Would I say it's directly a revenge tale? Not necessarily. And the people who get that specifically from the book are correct for them and for their perspective. But if somebody reads it and doesn't feel that exactly, I wouldn't say that is incorrect
Hmm.
either.
Yeah, for me, it wasn't like I disagreed. Like if someone were to be like, "You should read Birdsuit. It's a really interesting feminist revenge tale." It's not like I'd be like, "No, it's not." I can see where they're coming from when they make that statement, but I just felt like it sort of diminished the overall work and focused maybe on the later two chapters or whatever.
Yeah.
When the reality is the book is doing so many more, there's so many things happening, and that's not to say it's not feminist throughout. You know, I just wanted to kind of dig at your brain regarding this idea of being a feminist writer or what. I would like it for people to call me a feminist writer if they read my work and read it, but I would never say I'm trying to write this from any sort of feminist lens, if that makes sense. I don't know.
Yeah.
Just when I read the
It
review and I
does,
was
yeah.
thinking about it, I was like, this is too simple. It's too simple. But that even the rest of the book, going into so many different perspectives and seeing everything, it just felt like everyone in there was such a rounded and like full character. And I guess maybe that is a feminist way of writing, to claim that all people are rounded characters. I just needed to dig more into that idea, because I thought the end was perfect, just what it needed, but to diminish the whole story to the last chapter felt like a little much to me.
Yeah, and I think we as readers tend to do that a lot, where in order to recommend a book or dissuade people from reading a book, we dilute it into these little viral talking points and little categorical words that mean one thing to us, but may mean something completely different to another person. And then the most kind of like shocking soundbitey elements to make whatever case we're making about the book. And it's not something that can be entirely avoided, but I also really appreciate when readers want to talk about plot structure and want to talk about character relationships and want to talk about intertextual references and complications and their own experience of reading it, and aren't just looking for that little sort of soundbite moment. That makes sense.
Mm-hmm. For sure. Well, speaking of the ending, I wondered if you could talk a little bit about, without spoiling things or whatever, just I wondered as I came closer to the end as a reader how it was going to end. I was trying to figure out how to do it, how it would resolve efficiently or sufficiently. And I wondered if you struggled with the ending or if that was a natural part of the story, or how did you come to get to where it got?
Yeah, so this is actually a very interesting story and something that I thought I would never experience as an author, like so early in my career. But I knew sort of in my heart that this was the ending I wanted, and this was how like. The book is separated into three sort of sections, and I knew and felt sort of drawn toward the third section of the book being how it is for a very long time, for several years. And then as I was prepping for submission of the novel a few years ago, I got scared and changed my mind and wrote a completely different third part and completely different ending, because something about doing justice to characters. I knew something was off, but couldn't quite place what was off about it. And rather than manipulating things like perspective and description and the close and far sort of elements, I chose to make the third parted ending what I thought would be more palatable and more like easy on the reader. And I knew that it's not quite what I wanted, but I had never gone out on submission with a book before. So I did this. The book got a lot of the same sort of praise and slash critiques from a lot of editors who said, we really love this, but after 2/3 of the way in, it sort of feels like a completely different book.
Mm.
And I was expecting something that didn't happen, and not in a surprising way, but in a sort of like a lack of literary risk way. And when the book ultimately found its home with Invisible again, where my first book was published, I was incredibly, incredibly lucky that I got the choice and opportunity to work with Anique, the editor for the Pump, a second time. And when I was supposed to hand in my final, like, personally written draft on my own before developmental edits started, I was able to send an email to my editors. I think it was December 2022. And I was able to sort of take a risk and say, hey, I know that we've made the deal on this book and you wanted it like this, but something is not quite right with it still. And what I need, if you will allow me, is 2 more months to rewrite the entire last third of the book how I want it. And they unexpectedly said, like, we trust you and we would rather start developmental edits from a place of you feeling like it's the book you want to put out into the world. And so I wrote it how I had originally intended it in that January. We started full edits right after that. And it just feels so correct now, and so much more like both unexpected and surprising, yet everything has obviously led to this. And I think the lesson I really learned as an author from that was to trust my creative intuition more. And when you're writing for publication rather than writing for yourself and your characters, your sense of storytelling will be skewed by the expectations of the market and readers and all of these things, which isn't to say that you should write everything in a vacuum, not taking critique or inspiration from anybody else, but it is to say that as a writer, you know when something feels off and when you're pushing up against characters who want to be doing something completely different. And it took me more years than I would have liked to accept that and stop pushing, but it was worth it ultimately to get to where the book is right now.
Well, it's really great. Invisible was, flexible enough or allowed you to do that. I don't know how it is with most publishers, but the idea I had before being published was that the publishers were just like hard-nosed, like get it to the market type people, but it feels like
I'm particularly lucky when it comes to the amount of care that Invisible Publishing has for their authors.
Yeah. It's been surprising for me, and it shouldn't have been, I guess, but the sort of humanity of the people I'm working with in publishing, that is, I guess, from movies or media or whatever I knew of the publishing industry before being published, everyone felt like these big, intimidating individuals, but it turns out most people are just people like me, and they want the best work to be put out as well, so that's pretty cool. The last question I've been asking everyone who comes on here, it's just, I ask, is there anything about your work that you wish people would ask you about, that there's some aspect of it that you don't get to talk about that you wish you got to talk about?
Yeah, I guess something that I don't get to talk about as much is the relationship between mental health and in making art, and sort of what it means to have your present impacted by your past and your parents' past while thinking through somewhat of an artistic, like, quote unquote, legacy, like whatever that means to you, of how your work will serve other people or go unread when you're gone. I think a lot of Birdsuit deals with a sense of anxiety of what in your life you remember and how you remember it, and how you choose to portray it in this power imbalance of storyteller and reader, and then who remembers you when you're gone and how you are remembered when you're gone, and all of the complications that come up with that when you're someone who's creating art that will exist outside of you when you're gone.
Interesting. All right, so I guess that wraps up the interview portion. Thanks again. The last bit I always do is I ask people for their friends on recommendations. This comes from a bit that I was doing on TikTok in which I said, if you tell me any of these books are your favorite books, it's friends off. And they were just like books I thought were just shitty books that if I met someone and they were like, this is my favorite book, I'd be like, I don't know if we're going to be real friends. But that then changed into, I did enough of those. Like there are only so many of those books. So I changed it to friends on books. If you tell me this book is your favorite, then I would like to be your friend. And both of these were popular on TikTok, so I've brought it onto the pod, which is an extension of TikTok. Anyway, it's just a way of asking, are there some books that you have loved throughout your life or that you've read recently that you'd like to share with us or recommend?
Yeah, books that I've read recently. I am almost finished Anthony Oliveira's book, Spring, which is part memoir, part fictional recontextualization of biblical narrative and historical narrative, part poetry, part prose poetry.
Could you say that title again? I missed the title. Sorry.
Spring.
Dayspring?
Yeah, no
Sounds
problem. It came out a couple of weeks ago.
Oh, nice.
And it's absolutely incredible. I feel like from this like complicated memoir slash intimacy slash queerness directly in religious context, Anthony's book and Birdsuit are really cut from the same cloth.
Okay, thank you so much for being on. I'm glad we could finally sit down and get it done. And good luck with the book coming out. I hope all the success.
Thank you so much, Tim. This was really, really lovely. Thank you.
All right. Until next time.